My name is Walter Briggs. I'm 66 years old, and the morning my son-in-law told me to pack my things and get out, I was still wearing the black tie I'd worn to my daughter's memorial service 4 days earlier. He didn't wait for the flowers to die. He didn't wait for the sympathy casseroles to be eaten or for the last condolence card to arrive in the mailbox. He waited exactly 4 days, and then he sat down across from me at the kitchen table my daughter had picked out herself at a flea market in Chattanooga, and he told me I had 30 days to find somewhere else to live. I looked at him for a long moment. He had the same face he always had. Square jaw, expensive haircut, the kind of easy confidence that comes from never having been wrong about anything important, or at least from never having admitted it. He was 45 years old, and he had just buried his wife, and he was talking to me about real estate timelines. I said, "All right, Brandon." He blinked. That wasn't the response he expected. "I understand," I said, and I pushed back my chair and walked to the back porch. Behind me, I heard him exhale, relieved. He thought I was beaten. He thought a 66-year-old retired electrician with a bad shoulder and a chest full of grief had nothing left to fight with. He thought the hardest part was behind him. He had no idea that in 24 hours, I would make one phone call that would start unraveling everything he thought he owned. And in the weeks that followed, I would learn that my daughter hadn't fallen off that mountain trail. She'd been pushed. But let me back up, because this story starts long before Brandon Mercer ever came into our lives. Claire was my only child. Her mother, Diane, passed when Claire was 9 years old. Ovarian cancer, fast and cruel, the kind that gives you 3 months from diagnosis to funeral. After that, it was just the two of us in the house on Ridgecrest Lane in Chattanooga. A 3-bedroom craftsman on a half-acre lot that I had bought with Diane when we were 28 years old, the proudest purchase of my life. I'd rewired the entire thing myself, replaced every board on the front porch, built the kitchen shelves by hand. Every inch of that house had my fingerprints on it. Claire grew up in that house. She learned to ride a bike in that driveway. She did her homework at that kitchen table. After she graduated from UT and got her job at the environmental consulting firm, she came back home every Sunday for dinner. That was our rule. Sunday dinners. No exceptions. She met Brandon at a work conference in Nashville when she was 34. He was a real estate developer. All charm and momentum. The kind of man who made you feel like you were the most interesting person in the room. I tried to like him. Claire loved him. And she deserved to be loved back. So I swallowed my instincts and showed up at their wedding with a smile on my face. They moved into the house on Ridgecrest Lane 2 years into the marriage. My suggestion. Actually, Claire had mentioned they were house hunting, and the idea of strangers living in that home was something I couldn't sit with. So I offered it to them at a price that was barely above symbolic, with one condition. I kept the small apartment above the detached garage for myself. Claire agreed immediately. Brandon agreed with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. For 6 years, we made it work. Claire and I were close the way people are when it's been just the two of them against the world for a long time. We had dinner together a few nights a week. I fixed things around the house when they broke. I watched their dog when they traveled. Brandon and I were civil, respectful, never warm, but functional. Then Claire started hiking. About a year before she died, she got into trail running in the Smokies. Every weekend, she was out there. She had a group she went with, 4 or 5 people from her office. She came back from those trails with mud on her boots and something lighter in her eyes. I was glad for it. 8 months ago, she went out on a Saturday morning for a solo hike on a trail she'd done a dozen times before. She didn't come back. A search team found her at the base of a ravine off the Laurel Creek Trail. The official report said she had slipped on a wet rock near the ridge and fallen approximately 40 feet. Blunt force trauma to the head. Ruled an accident. Case closed. I couldn't make peace with it. Claire was meticulous on those trails. She had the right gear, the right boots, the right habits. She always texted me when she reached the trailhead. That Saturday, she had texted me at 8:47 a.m. She'd sounded fine, normal. She'd said she was going to try a new route near the eastern ridge. She'd said she'd call me at lunch. She never called. The memorial service was held on a Tuesday. Brandon stood at the front of the room in a charcoal suit, shaking hands, accepting hugs, thanking people for coming. He looked the way a grieving husband is supposed to look. I sat in the front row and watched him, and something cold settled in the back of my mind. It wasn't grief I saw on his face. It was calculation. The fourth morning after the service, he sat down across from me with a folder of papers and a cup of coffee and told me it was time to discuss the property. Claire and I had talked about this, he said, folding his hands on the table. The house is in both our names, and now that she's gone, I'm the surviving owner. I've been in touch with a real estate agent. He slid a document across the table. I already have a preliminary offer. It's a good number, Walter. Better than market. I looked at the paper. It was a listing agreement. My daughter had been in the ground for 4 days. I appreciate that you've been here, he continued. And I know this has been your home for a long time. That's why I'm giving you 30 days instead of the legal minimum. I think that's more than fair. I looked at the listing agreement. Then I looked at him. Where will you go? I asked. He shrugged. I have the condo in Nashville. I'll probably spend more time there going forward. Nashville. He had a condo in Nashville. I hadn't known that. All right, Brandon, I said. I understand. I walked to the back porch and stood there in the October air, looking out at the yard. The dogwood tree Claire had planted the year she and Brandon moved in was bare now, just dry branches against a gray sky. I stood there for a long time. Then I went to my apartment above the garage, sat down on the edge of my bed, and picked up my phone. The woman who answered on the second ring was Margaret Oakes. She was 58 years old and had been practicing estate law in Chattanooga for 30 years. I had hired her 15 years ago to help me put my affairs in order after a health scare left me thinking hard about what would happen to the house and to Claire if something happened to me. She wasn't just my attorney. She had known Claire since Claire was in her 20s. She had been at the memorial service. She had held my hand at the cemetery. Walter, she said, how are you holding up? Margaret, I said, I need you to pull the Briggs family trust documents. All of them. I need to see you first thing tomorrow. There was a pause. Then she said, I'll have everything ready. Walter, what's happened? I told her about the folder on the kitchen table, the listing agreement, the 30 days, the condo in Nashville. When I finished, the line was quiet for a moment. Get some sleep, Margaret said finally. Come to my office at 8 o'clock, and Walter Brandon is going to have a very difficult morning. Margaret's office was on the 4th floor of a building downtown on Market Street, overlooking the Tennessee River. I'd sat in that office a dozen times over the years, mostly for routine things. Updated wills, the occasional property question. That morning, the morning after Brandon handed me a listing agreement across my own kitchen table, the office felt different. Serious. The kind of room where things get decided. Margaret was already at her desk when I arrived. The Briggs family trust binder was open in front of her, thick with documents I'd signed over the years and mostly forgotten about. Sit down, Walter, she said. I sat. Do you remember what we did with this house in 2019? I thought back. 2019 had been the year of my shoulder surgery, followed by a 6-week recovery that left me with too much time to think about my own mortality. I had asked Margaret to help me make sure everything was in order. We put things in the trust, I said slowly. Not just things, Margaret said. Everything. The house on Ridgecrest Lane, the savings accounts, the investment portfolio, the rental property on Maple. We transferred all of it into the Briggs family trust. Irrevocable. She tapped the cover of the binder. I am the designated trustee. You are the primary beneficiary. Claire was the secondary beneficiary. And the trust specifies that in the event of her death, the assets revert entirely to you. I stared at her. The pieces were aligning slowly, the way things do when you're tired from grief and not thinking at full speed. So the house on Ridgecrest Lane, I said, has never legally belonged to Brandon Mercer, Margaret said, not even partially. When you and Claire arranged the sale 6 years ago, the trust was already in place. The deed was issued in the trust's name. Claire understood this. She was a beneficiary, which gave her the right to live there, but she could not transfer ownership, and neither could Brandon. Margaret paused. That listing agreement he put in front of you is worthless. He's trying to sell something he has no legal right to sell. The relief that moved through me was complicated. It was mixed with something else. Something heavier. He knew, I said. He may have assumed he knew, Margaret said carefully. Or he may not have understood how the trust worked. People often don't. Brandon Mercer is a real estate developer, I said. He understands how property ownership works. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Walter, there's something else I need to tell you. I got a call yesterday afternoon from Claire's insurance company. A routine notification. 3 months ago, someone submitted a request to change the beneficiary on Claire's life insurance policy, her employer-sponsored policy. The new beneficiary named was Brandon Mercer. The room was very still. Claire had named me, I said. Claire named you when she took out the policy 8 years ago. The change request was submitted in July. It was approved in August. Did Claire make that request? Margaret opened a folder on her desk. The signature on the change form matches Claire's name. But I had a colleague take a preliminary look at the document this morning, given everything you told me last night. She turned the folder toward me. Look at the signature. Now look at this one. The second signature was from Claire's voter registration, pulled from county records. I had looked at Claire's handwriting my whole life. I knew the way she crossed her T's, the particular slant of her capital C. The signature on the insurance form was cramped and careful, like someone drawing a signature rather than writing one. My daughter had not signed that form. The policy was worth $500,000, and if Brandon had changed the beneficiary in July, 2 months before Claire died in September, then he had known, even then, that she wasn't going to be alive much longer to question it. I drove back to the house on Ridgecrest Lane, feeling like the ground had shifted under my feet. I walked past Brandon's car in the driveway, past the dogwood tree in the yard, up the stairs to my apartment above the garage. I sat down at my desk and looked out the window at the house where I had raised my daughter, and I thought about what Margaret had just told me. My daughter had not fallen off that trail. I didn't know it yet, the way you know something when you have proof, but I knew it the way fathers know things about their children. I knew it the way I'd known Diane was sick 3 months before the doctors found it. The knowledge sat in my chest like a stone. The next morning, Margaret filed an emergency motion to freeze any attempted sale of the Ridgecrest Lane property, citing trust documentation. She also filed a formal challenge to the insurance beneficiary change, flagging the signature discrepancy. And she placed a call to a man named Frank DeLuca. Frank DeLuca was 61 years old, built like a man who had once been required to run and had decided to stop only recently. He had spent 22 years as a DEA agent before retiring to Chattanooga and opening a private investigation firm that specialized in financial crimes and domestic fraud. He drove a 12-year-old Jeep Cherokee, and he spoke in short sentences, and he had the particular stillness of someone who had spent decades watching people and knowing exactly when they were lying. He sat in Margaret's office on a Thursday morning, and I told him everything. The listing agreement, the condo in Nashville, the forged insurance form, Claire's hiking accident, the text she had sent me at 8:47 that morning, the way Brandon had looked at the memorial service. Frank listened without moving. When I finished, he said, "Tell me about his business." I told him what I knew. Brandon developed residential and commercial properties across East Tennessee and into Georgia. He'd been doing it for 15 years. He was successful, at least on the surface. Nice suits, nice watch. The condo in Nashville I hadn't known about. Did Claire ever mention anything about his work? Frank asked. Concerns. Anything that seemed off? I thought about it. There had been a phone call, maybe 6 months before she died. Claire had called me on a Tuesday evening, which was unusual because we usually talked on Sundays. She'd sounded distracted, careful in the way people are when they're thinking about something they haven't fully worked out yet. She'd asked me, almost casually, whether I knew anything about shell companies, whether a company could own another company to move money between them without anyone noticing. I'd thought it was a work question, something related to one of her environmental consulting projects. I'd told her I didn't know much about it. She'd said thanks and changed the subject. I told Frank about that phone call. He wrote something in his notebook. What was she working on at the time? Environmental impact assessments, mostly. She reviewed development projects, looked at water runoff, habitat disruption, that kind of thing. She'd been doing a lot of work in Hamilton County. Frank looked up. Hamilton County. What kind of development projects? I don't know the specifics. She mentioned one big one, a mixed-use development out near the river. Somebody was trying to build on old industrial land. She said the remediation costs were being underreported. Frank closed his notebook. Give me 2 weeks, he said. Don't confront Brandon. Don't change anything in the house. Don't give him any reason to think anything has changed. For 2 weeks, I went through the motions. I had breakfast in my apartment. I walked the yard. I waved to Brandon when I saw him coming or going. He was pleasant, slightly impatient, the way someone is when they're waiting for a process to complete. He made 2 more comments about my timeline, dressed up politely. I smiled and said I was working on it. Inside, I was waiting. Frank DeLuca came back on a Thursday afternoon, and what he laid on Margaret's conference table changed the shape of everything. Brandon Mercer had been running a financial fraud scheme through his real estate development company for at least 6 years. He created inflated valuations for properties, took out development loans against those valuations, siphoned a percentage into a network of LLCs registered in Delaware and Nevada, and used those funds to cover personal debts, including significant gambling losses, a pattern of wire transfers to accounts in the Cayman Islands, and payments to individuals whose connection to the business was unclear. The total amount moved through the scheme was somewhere north of $2 million. And Claire had found it. Her company had been hired to review the environmental impact assessment on the Riverbend development, the big, mixed-use project on the old industrial land. While she was reviewing the project financials for context, the way environmental consultants sometimes do when remediation costs are involved, she had noticed irregularities in how the remediation budget had been structured. She'd pulled on the thread. She was methodical, thorough. The same qualities that had made her good at her job had led her into something she hadn't expected. Frank had found her work files on the company server, backed up to a cloud account that Brandon wouldn't have known about. She had flagged the irregularities in a memo dated 6 weeks before she died. She had sent a copy of that memo to a contact at the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation. She had not yet sent it to law enforcement directly, but she had also, Frank discovered, placed a call to the Hamilton County District Attorney's Office 2 weeks before her death. She had been 3 conversations away from ending Brandon's entire operation, and then she had gone hiking alone on a trail she knew well on a clear Saturday morning and had not come home. Frank laid a photograph on the table. It was a still from a traffic camera on the road leading to the Laurel Creek trailhead. Timestamp: 7:54 a.m. The morning Claire died. A dark green pickup truck, the kind Brandon had owned for 2 years and sold, abruptly, 4 weeks after Claire's death, was traveling toward the trailhead at 7:54. Claire had texted me from the trailhead at 8:47. The drive from the house to the trailhead was 45 minutes. Brandon had been there before her. Margaret was already on the phone with the Hamilton County District Attorney before Frank finished talking. I sat in the leather chair in the corner of her office and looked out at the river and felt the grief in my chest rearrange itself into something that had an edge to it. My daughter had found out what kind of man she'd married. She had tried to do the right thing, and he had made sure she would never finish that conversation. The forensic re-examination of Claire's case was ordered by the Hamilton County DA's office on a Monday. Dr. Susan Park, the Deputy Chief Medical Examiner, conducted the review personally. She was 49 years old, precise and careful, and she had a reputation for being willing to revise her conclusions when new evidence warranted it. Her findings came back on a Friday. The original cause of death had been listed as blunt force trauma consistent with a fall from elevation. Dr. Park's review found that the primary impact site on Claire's skull was inconsistent with the typical injury pattern from an uncontrolled fall onto irregular rock surfaces. The angle, the concentration of force, the absence of secondary impact injuries that would be expected from a tumbling fall, all of it pointed toward a single, directed blow, followed by a body being repositioned. There was no evidence of defensive wounds, which would have been expected if Claire had been conscious and aware of a threat. The injury was most consistent with a blow from behind, delivered while she was standing at or near the edge. She never saw it coming. I read that paragraph 3 times. Then I set the report down on Margaret's desk, and I walked to the window, and I pressed my forehead against the cool glass, and I let myself cry for the first time since the morning they found her. Not the controlled grief of a father who has to stay upright for the sake of everyone around him, but the real kind. The kind that doesn't have a shape. Margaret gave me 20 minutes. Then, she knocked on the glass partition and held up her phone. "The DA is ready," she said. "It's time." Brandon was arrested on a Tuesday morning. I know this because Margaret's paralegal called me the moment she got the confirmation. I was in the backyard at the time, pulling dead stems from the flower bed Claire had planted along the back fence. Zinnias. She'd always planted zinnias because her mother had liked them. I was cleaning them up for the winter, the way I always had. I stood in the yard with my phone in my hand and listened to the notification, and then I set the phone in my pocket and kept working. They took him at his office, apparently. 2 detectives from the Hamilton County Sheriff's Department and 2 agents from the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. The charges were formal and extensive. First-degree murder, insurance fraud, wire fraud, financial crimes spanning 6 years. The DA's office had been building the case for 3 weeks by that point, quietly and thoroughly, while Brandon continued coming and going from the house on Ridgecrest Lane, checking in with his real estate agent, asking me casually if I'd made any decisions about where I was going to live. I had not made any decisions. I had told him each time. I was still thinking it over. What I had been thinking over, in fact, was what Margaret and I were going to do about the trade center. That part started with a conversation we'd had late one evening in her office, about a month into the investigation. We'd been going over the trust documents again, talking about what would happen to the estate once the legal proceedings were resolved. The house, the investment accounts, everything Claire had been a beneficiary of, all of it would remain in the Briggs family trust under my management. It was more than I needed. More than one person needed, and Claire wasn't there to inherit it. I told Margaret about Claire's work, about the memo she'd written, the calls she'd made, the thread she'd pulled, even knowing it led somewhere dangerous, about the way she'd always approached her job not as a career but as something that actually mattered. She had believed in leaving places better than she found them. Literally. That was what her whole professional life had been about. "There's a piece of land," I said, "up near the edge of the Sequoia Hills neighborhood. It's been sitting vacant for years. Industrial brownfield. Owner has been trying to unload it for a decade." I pulled out a folded paper I'd been carrying around for 2 weeks. "I've been thinking about it. Environmental remediation, native plantings, walking trails, an outdoor education center for kids who don't have access to green space." Margaret looked at the paper for a long moment. "We'd call it the Claire Briggs Environmental Learning Center," I said. She'd hate a building named after her, but she'd like trails. Margaret set the paper down carefully. "I'll start looking into the property," she said. The trial lasted 4 months. The jury deliberated for 2 days. I was not in the courtroom for the verdict. I had made my peace with what I needed to make my peace with, and I didn't need to see Brandon's face when the word came back. Margaret called me at 11:23 on a Wednesday morning. "Guilty," she said. "All counts." I was standing in the kitchen on Ridgecrest Lane, Diane's kitchen, the kitchen I'd wired myself when we moved in 38 years ago. The coffee maker was running. October light was coming through the window over the sink, the kind of flat golden light that Chattanooga does in the fall. I had Claire's coffee mug on the counter next to mine, the one with the trail map of the Smokies on it that she'd bought at a gas station once and used every single day. "Thank you, Margaret," I said. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder of my daughter. The fraud charges added concurrent sentences that were almost beside the point. I set down the phone and poured myself a cup of coffee and stood at the kitchen window for a long time. The groundbreaking for the Claire Briggs Environmental Learning Center was held on a Saturday in April, 7 months after Brandon's arrest, and 2 weeks after the last paperwork cleared. The land had been remediated over the winter, and on the day of the groundbreaking, the first section of the walking trail was already staked out through the low meadow. A small crowd had come, people from Claire's firm, neighbors from Ridgecrest Lane, her friends from the hiking group, a few people I didn't know who had read about the project and showed up anyway. I stood at the edge of the meadow in my good jacket and watched people walk the staked trail, pointing at the markers, showing where the oak trees would be planted, where the native wildflower sections would go, where the outdoor classroom pavilion would stand. 2 kids from the elementary school down the road were already running along the dirt path, their sneakers kicking up dust. Margaret stood next to me with her hands in her coat pockets. "She would say you went overboard," Margaret said. "She would be right," I said. We stood there in the April sun and listened to the kids running the trail. Somewhere in the meadow, somebody had already planted a handful of zinnias along the path marker. A small gesture nobody had planned. I don't know who did it, but there they were, bright orange in the April light, exactly the kind of thing Claire would have done. I thought about what Brandon had seen when he looked at me across that kitchen table. An old man in a funeral tie, a retired electrician with a bad shoulder and nowhere to go. Someone so hollowed out by grief that 30 days and a listing agreement would be enough to knock him down for good. He had seen the surface of a thing and thought he understood the whole of it. That is the particular blindness of people who measure everything in terms of what they can take. They look at a man who has spent 40 years building something careful and solid, and they see only what's in front of them. They don't see the trust documents. They don't see the 40 years of relationships, of showing up, of being the kind of person other people answer the phone for at 9 at night. They don't see what gets built in silence over a lifetime. They see an old man with a bad hip and a broken heart, and they think they've already won. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who only looked at the surface, I want you to tell me about it in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what happened when they finally understood what they had missed. Your words find me, and they matter. And if you believe that what we build in silence is what outlasts everything else, please hit subscribe. There's more to come. I'm not done yet.